Good evening, and welcome to tonight's weekly news, where we bring you the latest in the ongoing worldwide conflict. News from the League of Nations. As days before the beginning of the Zurich Conference, a single captain commanding an ad hoc international fleet led a mad attack on a massive Morgana force controlling the Skagerrak Strait. The captain's determination, string of previous successes, and relentless publicization won the battle's support of both the Kriegsmarine and the Royal Navy, and in doing so won the Battle of the Skagerrak. Sean Lester, and those at the League striving for greater unofficial cooperation, had been handed a priceless gift in their efforts to coordinate an international response to the Morgana threat. This was not the only view that would be present at Zurich, however. Joseph Avenal maintained that the League could only work through members, and that it could not endorse the International Naval Coalition until all belligerent parties had rejoined the League. News from the Allies. As with careful coordination between the Royal Navy and the Marine Nationale, the necessary channel defenses were established and the ferries began. The professionalism of the logistics, planning, and communication spoke well of the Allies' chances in the war ahead. News from Italy. As despite the recent tempo of operations, the Regia Marina turned its attention to Morgana forces lurking in the Adriatic Sea. The Morganas had become increasingly proficient in disguising themselves in the islands, and the experience of the campaign was considered likely to prove important in rooting them out comprehensively. The Dalmatian Islands campaign was promoted as a boon to Yugoslavia as well as to Italy, and was duly applauded by the League of Nations as such, but Prince Paul must have seen an iron fist inside the velvet glove, as he was certainly meant to. The continued activity sapped the Regia Marina's ability to continue operations, however. The oil situation in particular was becoming a concern. Mussolini's regime was altogether satisfied with the weak. An expansion to the types of people affected by police confinement was also announced. The aftermath of the destruction of Vanity's palace was taking turns no one had predicted. Artists all over Italy began to sketch it as if by memory, and discussion of its inhuman aesthetics flowered in the bars and salons of Milan and Napoli. It was proving difficult for the Italian people not to mourn the strange beauty which they had destroyed. It was also proving difficult for Vanity to accept her defeat. She raged in the Tyrrhenian Sea, vowing imminent revenge. News from Japan, as preparations for the ceremony at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal continued apace. Japan closed the waters of the Yellow Sea to non-military ships. Sedition had evidently attacked Darien, although casualties are rumored fortunately to be light. Access to the Ryojin province was similarly barred to all non-military personnel. In the aftermath of the Soviet-Romanian attack on disease, governments around the world sought assurances that she was not involved, and up to her old tricks. The Japanese government declined to respond until their inspectors completed their investigation. How long the situation would persist was unknown, but it was generally recognized that it would soon affect commerce. The speed and effectiveness of the response by the newly restored Guard District improved the situation between the Army and the Navy. News from the United States. In the waters adjoining the Pacific Northwest, American and Canadian, the U.S. Navy cracked down hard on Morgana raiders that had heretofore escaped the more southerly provinces by hiding in the Alexander Archipelago. With input from the Belle Mahan, new tactics were tested against Morgana destroyers and found to be strikingly effective. For the first time in a month, Vancouver was entirely free of the effects of Morgana mist, and the people of Western Canada were clearly grateful. Unfortunately for the Navy, the Morgana cowardice spent the week cavorting around the eastern seaboard, never doing too much damage, never staying still long enough to be at much risk, but constantly proclaiming that American forces were too afraid to secure their own waters. American admirals knew that it was a trap, that she was trying to divert American forces away for some reason, but the emerging wartime censorship was no match for sedition's regular broadcasts all over the East Coast. Although everyone knew that Morgana broadcasts were lies and couldn't be trusted, there was just enough truth in it to make people angry and to keep them tuning in. Much news from the United Kingdom. As the Marine Nationale took leadership in the Channel, the British Expeditionary Force, British Army forces under the command of General Lord Gort, tasked with fighting the war against Germany and mainland Europe, traveled from England and Wales to northern France. Within weeks they would be deployed to join their allies along the Belgian-French border and at the Maginot Line. Meanwhile, the King's ships were at sea. Answering the call of the captain, Home Fleet steamed eastward towards the Morgana fleets massing off Skagerrak on the 24th of October. Although several destroyer squadrons had not yet arrived to join the fleet, they decided to proceed immediately. At first, the battle was in favor of the British, as the Morganas were so disorganized and in some cases fighting among themselves, that they were only sporadic to return fire. However, once the treasons came up, the Morgana fire began to increase at once. The enemy could not be sunk faster than they arrived in formation. Things might have taken a turn for the worse due to the pure volume of shell fire, save for an unexpected source of help. The Kriegsmarine arrived and turned the tables. Caught between the two fleets, the Morgana formation shattered within half an hour, most fleeing south into the Wilhelmshaven barrage and their dooms. During the succeeding night battle, there were a few tense moments when the two fleets nearly fired upon one another, but open conflict was avoided. After the last action of the evening, Ajax and Blücher gave each other 21-gun salutes, a naval courtesy as unexpected as it was unlikely to be repeated. The victory was received oddly back home, however. There was a kind of popular malaise developing. The common people of Britain were finding the basics of everyday life harder and harder to find, but it seemed like the toffs and the politicians and anybody who knew somebody were getting along very nicely. British boys were being sent to fight the Germans in France, but at the same time the Navy was keeping the Morganas from pushing past Denmark and raining hell on German ports. News from France, with the Marine Nationale patrolling north and south of the Dover barrage, and train ferries already making the crossing to the Channel ports, the BEF began assembly near Arras. It would be at least 2 weeks before they were prepared to take up their defense sector. It was a logistical triumph for France and the Allies in virtually every particular. The two fleets would henceforth be able to collaborate even more deeply. The Marine Nationale and the Royal Navy proved that they could coordinate smoothly under duress, while at the same time contributing to the fight against the Morganas. The French in particular were active in devising the signals and protocols that would enable smoother joint operations. The Marine Nationale was to be represented by the 11th Destroyer Division at Skagerrak, but they were unable to reach the home fleet before the battle was joined. They aided in sweeping for Morganas on the 25th, however. Unfortunately, the Morganas active around the Cape Verde Peninsula went unchecked, wreaking havoc on Dakar and pillaging the West African trade lanes. Much news from Germany, as the Kriegsmarine had been driven from the North Sea weeks before by the Allies, but when the captain of the improvised international fleet called for assistance against the Morganas swarming into the Skagerrak Strait, the Kriegsmarine responded with all the force they could bring. Caught between the two fleets, the Morgana formation shattered within half an hour, most fleeing south into the Wilhelmshaven barrage and to their dooms. During the succeeding night battle, there were a few tense moments when the two fleets nearly fired upon one another, but open conflict was avoided. In a very real sense, it was also a win for the League of Nations, and the Germans made it clear that it would continue to support League efforts to address the Morgana threat as long as the League didn't presume to interfere with the course of legitimate war on land. The Morgana situation in the southern Baltic was becoming more complicated, however. After the surrender of Hell, the small garrison was forced to retreat after a full-scale attack by the Morganas. Observation shows that they are erecting a structure off the east coast. The Kriegsmarine was forced to block traffic at the mouth of the Vistula. There was a Morgana obstruction that needed to be removed very carefully. The work was not completed at the week's end, raising the possibility of unstable ordnance or possibly something worse. The port of Danzig was in a frenzy in the aftermath. Meanwhile, rumors began to surface that a mysteriously displaced Admiral Scheer had seized an American cargo ship somewhere in the West Atlantic. And finally, news from the Soviet Union. With Morganas massing in the Skagerrak Strait and building unnatural structures near the Hel Peninsula, the Soviets were preoccupied with the Baltic this week. Indeed, at one point, directing the Baltic Fleet to make itself a wall outside of Neva Bay in anticipation of disaster. Fortunately, no attack came. Much to the satisfaction of the League of Nations, negotiations with Finland proceeded under terms without a mainland concession, however. Juho Paasikivi departed Leningrad without signing an accord. Helsinki first would need to be consulted. Stalin noted that the Finns had begun mobilizing and warned, "This cannot go on for long without danger of accidents." It is unknown how Helsinki will receive this latest offer. Meanwhile, in the White Sea, the Northern Fleet reported that a number of Avarice sightings, albeit at some distance from human habitation. After a period of some confusion, they were ordered not to engage unless Avarice acted provocatively. There was no point in wasting precious resources and risking human lives for control of sea ice and pretty views of the Northern Lights. Unrelated, a contingent of NKVD arrived at Polyarny and began routine reviews with local party committees of naval personnel. That's all for this week. Join us next week again as we bring you the latest news from around the world. From all of us here at the studio, good night, and stay safe out there.